Hello everybody, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Happy February. This is the month of love. I hope that you are experiencing a wonderful month and that you are well and that you are healthy, and so is your family. Thank you for tuning back to Chapter 2 of the Domineering CEO. If you have not listened to Chapter 1, it is located in my videos below. I hope that you have been enjoying my content, and if you are new here, please hit that subscribe button and support me. Now I invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy.
We were crazy in love, careless and young, but I wouldn't change it. You had me right from the start, you gave me your all, but something changed, yeah. And I sometimes drive you crazy. Yeah, I know, I sometimes drive you crazy. And I think that's why you've been building up this wall now, and I don't really know how I'm supposed to break it down. I tried peeking through the cracks, saw the light but couldn't catch it. Now the one is breaking down. You should let me love you, but you're making it so hard to.
Morning sun rose high in the sky, creating an orange glow that seemed like a ghost, haunting the last of its moments as Rylee rode the bicycle down the dirt path. Erick's house was coming up, and she could see his father's broken-down truck in the front. She smiled to herself as she rode past, and the wind picked up as she made it out of the thick forested trees. It was then that she heard the honking, and she stopped to find Erick driving down the road. A smile was on his face as he stopped the car beside her and rolled the window down. "Let me give you a ride." She smiled brightly as he parked and came to put the bike in the bed of the truck, and then he opened the passenger side door and she got in. Erick had cleaned up, shaved even, and going as far as brushing his hair back, not allowing her to do her normal gesture of pushing his strand. "You look like you're going on a date," Rylee said as he got in and started the car. "Where to?" he asked as he smiled. "I just might. You never know." "Down the road until the red lights and make a left, all the way to the courthouse." "I thought you said it wasn't that far. The courthouse is quite a drive." "It's not far," she defended herself. "It's the perfect distance for me to warm up my body." He started driving and made a face. "Well, I wouldn't want you going there smelling like you just ran a marathon." Laughing, Rylee replied, "I brought the perfume you gave me last Christmas." They drove in silence until they reached the road leading to Brinley's house. As Erick drove in, he whistled out an unbelievable tune and shook his head. "Right? They're loaded," Rylee said. "You can say that again. Holy buckets, how much does this place cost?" "I don't know, but I'm sure it is something I will never have." As they pulled up to the front of the house, Rylee got out of the car, just as Erick did, and he picked up the bike from the bed of the truck. When he had just put it down, the front door opened and Theseus walked out in a black suit. He had a cup of coffee in his hand as he strolled toward them. Immediately, Rylee saw Erick's face lose color as he handed the bike to her. "You want me to pick you up later?" he asked. Shaking her head, she replied, "No, it's okay. I can bike home." "Good morning," Theseus said as he took a sip of his coffee. "Good morning. This is my friend and neighbor Erick. Erick, this is Brinley's grandson, Theseus." Erick nodded and saluted him. "Hello." Theseus brought up his cup to salute him in return. "Hello, neighbor and friend." And then he looked at Rylee. "You can set that in the garage if you'd like." "Is it okay if I just leave it here?" "Sure, that's fine too. My father would like to meet with you before he leaves for work." Rylee smiled and nodded. "Oh, great." Then she turned to Erick. "Thanks for the ride." He only smiled and nodded at her as he got back into his truck. She left with Theseus into the house, but she felt Erick's eyes on the back of her head until she disappeared inside. "This is my father, Kingston Vang." Theseus watched as the two shook hands and Rylee took a seat. She was wearing overall jeans today, making her figure appear as it was beneath that oversized sweater she wore yesterday. His father was smiling at her as he sat down, dressed in a suit, ready to go to the office. His father had the same looks as he did, but he had inherited his mother's brown eyes instead of his father's hazed ones. His grandma came down the stairs wearing a flowing beige dress and smiled at them. "Good morning, Rylee. It's good to see you." Rylee stood up and offered her bright smile. "Hi, Mrs. Vang. It's wonderful to see you. You look beautiful." "Call me Brindley. Have a seat. Kingston just has a few things to ask you, and then we'll get started on our day as the boys leave for work." Nodding, she sat down and smiled as his father cleared his throat and began. "I want to thank you for taking the position as caretaker for my mother. I want to warn you that she is a stubborn woman at times, so if she becomes too much, come to me." This got a laugh from his grandma. "Theseus and I are often away on trips, so we want someone here to help out. I'm glad that my mother chose you, and now I can see why. You have that energy to uplift her." "Thank you. I'm so glad to be here, and thank you for accepting me. I am a fast learner, and I will do my best." "Great." Then he turned to him. "Ready?" "Yeah, let's go." Theseus stood and gave her a smile. "Thank you. Have a good day." The two walked to the garage and got into the car as Stan drove them toward the office. His father opened up his laptop and began clacking away as Stan came to a stop at a red light. "What do you think of her?" Kingston asked. Theseus cleared his throat and felt this conversation could go right or wrong, depending on how he answered. "I like her. She is very professional." "I didn't ask if she was." Laughing, he replied, "Father, I know what you are asking. The thing is, I already met her a few days ago, and I knew she would be the perfect person to take the job." His father's eyebrows rose in shock. "When did you meet her?" "I was coming back from a meeting and decided to stop by the sculpture garden. Stan and I were having a conversation, and she happened to step out as he was pulling away from the parking lot. She was not afraid to make me feel small at all. That's how I knew she could handle Grandma." His father laughed and closed his laptop. "No wonder. Prepare for Japan?" "Yes, sir. Let's go close this deal." He didn't like traveling so far from home, but he knew that it had to be done. His father, though, loved it, and had actually met a woman in Japan several years ago. Every now and then when he visited, he would spend some quiet time with her. Theseus didn't mind because his father was, after all, only human. His mother had been gone for a long time, and loneliness was haunting to the soul. He just wanted his father to be happy. When they arrived, his father parted ways to his office while he went to his. Jennifer looked up with a smile and handed him his messages, and he opened the door to walk in. No Della today, and he turned his laptop on as he sat down for the first meeting of the day. At noon, his father had sent him an email he was out with a client for lunch, and Theseus decided to stop by his favorite deli around the corner to pick up his banh mi sandwich. The weather was nice as he stepped outside and rounded the corner. As he walked into the deli, he noticed her gazing at the selection of drinks in the fridge. He also noticed a few men watching her as she frowned. He walked over and placed a hand on the small of her back. Immediately, he noticed the men behind him look away, and he smiled. Rylee jerked up and a smile formed on her face. "Theseus, what are you doing here?" she asked. "I work just around the corner." "What are you doing here? Don't tell me you rode your bike here." Shaking her head, she said, No. I called a taxi, even though Brindley said I could take the family car. She asked me to come pick up some things for her to eat, but I'm not sure what she'd like. I asked her, but she said just pick anything I wanted. Help me out?" Smiling, he reached for the Thai tea can and a couple of dragon fruits. He put them into her basket, and her smile appeared. "My grandma loves those. Have you had lunch yet?" "No, I'm gonna get something for me, and then I'll head back. The taxi is waiting for me." Theseus waited until she'd made her selection, and he picked up his sandwich. And then he reached for everything in her hands and made his way to pay. When she tried to intervene, he simply just put his arm around her, and she stopped moving. The cashier blushed as he paid for everything, and he walked her out, never losing focus on the men who kept staring at her. "You didn't have to walk me back to the taxi," Rylee said as she got into the back seat. He closed the door and she moved to the opened window. "I did. You were so focused on your task that you didn't see who was watching you in there. Be aware of your surroundings, Rylee." Then he handed the driver a $100 bill. "Take the lady straight home and make sure she's there safely." He took the bill and nodded. "Thank you, sir." Rylee smiled and muttered a thanks as the taxi drove off. When he turned around, he saw the men he'd noticed getting into a blue sedan, and he made note of the car as he strolled back to his office. "You met Theseus at the deli?" Brinley asked as a young girl brought out the plate of cut-up dragon fruits and drink for her. She truly was a sweetheart and made the day go by faster. Loneliness had been creeping up to her these past few years, and when her eyesight began to get blurry, she had to stop driving and going out to the country clubs. Her friends had visited here and there, but the active social life she once led came to a screeching halt. "Yes, he was so kind, paying for everything, even giving the driver an embarrassing tip. I'm sure that made his day." Brinley smiled and took a fork to grab a piece of the fruit. Have some. It's wonderful. These are my favorites." Rylee took a bite and nodded. "Yes, they are very sweet." "Sit down. Talk to me a while." She sat down and took another piece of fruit. "How long were you and your husband married before he passed?" She smiled. "We were together for 55 years. And then she added, "But we weren't in love." Rylee's face lost color, and she looked a bit uncomfortable. Brinley laughed and reached over to tap her hand for reassurance. "Ask me why." "Why?" "Because he was never home long enough to make me fall in love with him. Our marriage was arranged by our parents, and he was a soldier when I first met him. He was gone all the time, and that's why we only had one son. He was home long enough to give me one child, and the rest was spent away from me. But that didn't mean he was faithful. He had plenty of women elsewhere, children too, but they didn't survive long enough to be claimed as part of the family heritage." Rylee sat back in her seat, her face broken in shock. "Wow, I don't know what I would do if my husband was like that. How did you survive?" Shrugging, Brinley replied, "You don't. You just force yourself to, and each day becomes easier. It got better when I gave birth to Kingston. He was my only one reason to remain sane. Leonard was always busy, working and away from home. He hardly paid any attention to me. I was neglected, and Kingston was my only place of peace." "You never loved him?" "I guess I wouldn't say I never loved him. I would say I was never in love with him. I got used to the idea of having a husband in name, and everywhere I went, I would introduce myself as Leonard's wife, but I never had a husband to show for it. My mother-in-law was the same as me. My father-in-law was gone all the time, but I had a better lifestyle, as none of the women Leonard slept with came begging at the door. For my mother-in-law, she had many young women come with pregnant bellies to claim stake on the family heritage line. But the women couldn't last long enough because they weren't patient like my mother-in-law, and they were soon kicked out or would experience a miscarriage and leave soon after." "Wow, that must have been hard for you, being so lonely and so young. Do you feel you have wasted your life?" Rylee asked. Brinley chewed her fruit and shrugged her thin shoulders. "I certainly did feel that way at one point, but that was when I was a lot younger and I had no clue to my future life. Now I'm a happier woman, and I know where I stand. I don't need a man to make me happy, and if I am content with what I have, I'm already a grand winner. Sure, it gets lonely at times, but doesn't loneliness visit us all?" Smiling, Rylee replied, "You're right, I suppose it does. Wow, you're such a brave woman. I don't think I could ever do what you did." "No, you just haven't experienced it yet. I think when we listen to what others say about their story, we assume we could never become that. But when we start to walk the same path, we find that our hearts are a lot stronger than we think and what we give credit for. You might say that now, but when you meet the man your sights have intended on having as your own, you would be surprised as to how far you would go. I loved Leonard as the man who kept a roof over my head and the father of my child, but I didn't love him as the man who owned my heart and soul. That's the only regret I have in this life, is that I never truly experienced that wild wind love that swept me off my feet. I think everyone should at least have that once and make a crazy decision because of it." Rylee chuckled. Do you, do you think you'll get it even at this stage of your life? Smiling, Brinley replied, "Oh, I have never given up, young lady." When the time came for Erick to pick her up, he took the time to dress up. And by dress up, he literally meant it. He pulled out the nicest button-down shirt he owned and even pressed his jeans. He brushed his hair to the point where he slicked back without falling forward, and even sprayed some of that cologne that Rylee got him on his birthday 2 years ago. When he turned to the mirror, he looked like a shining penny. As he hopped into his truck and made the drive to the mansion where she worked, he felt a prick of jealousy bite him. He hadn't the courage to speak his truth, so now he was on the sideline as she worked within the home of a very handsome man. Not only handsome, but rich too. And she was there almost every day. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel as he waited for the light to turn green. How will he announce his love for her? Most importantly, how will she take it? Will she accept him? Letting out a hot breath, Erick drove the rest of the way, fighting against his mind, and when he arrived, he saw her and an old lady sitting together on the front lawn. A picnic was sprawled before them, and they were laughing about something. He parked the car as he got out. Rylee stood up, and a smile showed on her face. "Erick, I thought I said I would just bike home," she cried as she came to him and took his hand in hers. The way she looked up at him right now ached him in places deep within him. He wanted nothing more than to bend down and kiss her. "And I said I would pick you up," he replied as he shoved the thoughts out of the way. "Rylee, introduce your gentleman caller to me," the old woman said. Rylee took his hand and led him to where she was sitting on the thick white blanket. As they neared, he noticed how she had a genuine smile and bright eyes. "Mrs. Brinley, this is my friend and neighbor Erick, the one I was telling you about," Rylee said. And then she turned to him. "Erick, this is Mrs. Brinley Vang, the madame of this household." Erick knelt down when she offered her hand, and he took it. "Hello, Mrs. Brinley Vang. It's wonderful to meet you." She smiled and tapped his hand. "Likewise. Sit down and have some snacks with us. Rylee prepared these, you know." "I bet she did," he said as he made himself comfortable and Rylee joined them. "Mrs. Brinley, how was my friend today as your caretaker? Did she do her job well?" "She did a superb job. I didn't make a mistake in hiring her." "I suppose you are here to whisk her away, are you?" Erick smiled and nodded. "Yes, I am. If you no longer require her for anything, that is. Go ahead. Theseus and Kingston are just about to return home soon." She turned to Rylee. "Go on home. I'll see you tomorrow morning. Let me help you clear these out and then we'll go." On the ride back home, Rylee spent the time talking about how wonderful Brinley was and how kind of a woman she turned out to be. The history and background of the woman surprised Erick because he'd assumed her to be quite strict. Anyways, her son and grandson are leaving to Japan this week, so I'll be spending the night for a week in the guest bedroom. Erick turned toward her as they entered the driveway of her home. "What?" Smiling, Rylee replied, "Yeah, I mean, it makes sense, doesn't it? Because they won't be around at all, and she'll need me for a lot of things. She looks pretty fit for someone hiring a caretaker." Rylee made a disgusted sound and laughed. "Oh, Erick, stop your bickering. She's a wonderful old lady, and I love spending time with her. Thanks for picking me up, but tomorrow you won't have to drop me off. She'll send the driver to pick me up." "Driver?" Erick asked as he parked the car in front of her house. He turned to her and saw her eyes gazing at him, but not really seeing him for who he was. "I'm glad you like your job." Smiling, she replied, "Are you kidding? I love it. It's incredible, and she even gave me a bonus today just because I did so much on my first day. This will really help my parents out." She got out of the car and closed the door, waving to him as she ran up the stairs to the house, and he let out the breath he'd been holding and wondered if he could ever have the courage to tell the truth. Rylee packed the last sweater into her suitcase as her mother walked into her room and crossed her arms, giving her a smile as she leaned against the door. She looked up and closed her suitcase as she zipped it and stood up. "Done!" she cried. "How long will you be staying there?" her mother asked. "Her son and grandson will be home next week. I'll come back then. If you need anything, just give the house a ring." She dug into her purse and took out a card as her mother walked in and took it. "She's such a beautiful soul, Mom. I got to learn a lot about her yesterday, and she's truly someone with a lot of wisdom." "I'm someone with a lot of wisdom," her mother cried in defense. "I'm joking. I'm glad you're learning a lot. Well, I think I saw a driver out front. Rylee grabbed the suitcase, and her mother walked down the stairs with her. Her mother opened the front door, and the first thing Rylee saw was the black, sleek Lincoln, and the driver who came out was none other than the man she'd had an encounter with. She almost laughed as his face turned red and she stopped walking. "You!" she cried. "You!" he shouted. "You two know each other?" her mother asked. Rylee laughed and shook her head. "It's a long story. How is it you? Was it..." And then her voice dropped. "Oh my God. Was it Mrs. Brinley in the back seat the other day?" He shook his head. "No, allow me to introduce myself. I'm Stan, the family driver. I've been with the Vangs for almost 2 decades now, and I did not mean for what happened to happen that day. But it was Mr. Vang in the back seat." "What happened?" her mother asked, intrigued now. "Nothing." "Well, something happened," her mother insisted. "Otherwise, you'd never react this way." "Ma'am, I assure you it was never intentional. I was pulling out and did not see Miss Rylee." "What?" her mother said. "Stop, Mom," Rylee said as she jumped in between them. She turned to Stan and asked, "You said Mr. Vang was in the car. Which one, father or son?" "Son," Stan said. Rylee shut her eyes. "Oh, God damn it." How would she face Theseus now? She let out a heavy breath as Stan picked up her luggage and put it into the trunk. She hugged her mother and got into the back seat as Stan began driving. She had an urge to kick herself in the butt as she thought about all the things she'd say to Theseus and came up blank. That day, she looked rudely into the back seat as she screamed for whoever sat back there to hire another driver. She'd been so professional upon meeting him the first time, and then now she shut her eyes and muttered beneath her breath. When they arrived, she saw Brinley already dressed and outside, shears in hand, cutting the roses in the front. She got out as Stan went to collect her luggage to bring into the house. Brinley looked a little pale as Rylee made her way up to her. "Good morning, Mrs. Brinley. How are you?" Before she could answer, the door opened and Theseus walked out to join them with his father behind him. But oddly enough, Theseus wasn't dressed for the office. Instead, he was wearing comfortable jeans and a black t-shirt, a look that had her looking twice. "Good morning, Rylee," Theseus said as he nodded at Stan walking past them. Then his gaze met hers and a ghost of a smile appeared on his face. She blushed and turned her attention to Brinley, who was suddenly reaching out her hands to her. Rylee noticed that she was shaking, and as she caught Brinley's hand, the shears the woman was holding stabbed her in the palm. As they both fell, Kingston caught his mother and Theseus caught her. The moment she saw the wide open cut on her flesh, she fainted. Theseus watched as her eyes fluttered awake, and the confused expression came over her as she stared at him. He simply leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and raised an eyebrow. She looked around, and then she blinked a few times before she saw her bandaged hand. "You were out like a light when you saw the gash," Theseus said. She turned to look at him. "Did you bandage this up?" "No," he said, shaking his head. "We called our personal doctor here to the house. You have about 5 stitches." She gasped and coughed as she shut her eyes. "Oh, my Lord!" "Don't," he said as he reached over and helped her to sit up. "My grandmother feels terrible." Rylee suddenly remembered and threw her feet over the side of the bed. "Oh, my!" When she tried to stand up, she almost lost her balance, and he caught her as he helped her to sit down. "What's wrong with me?" "The anesthesia is wearing off, but you're still highly medicated. My grandmother is fine. Stan is with her." "Is she all right?" "No. She was suffering some high anxiety last night and had an episode where she couldn't breathe. My father is going to Japan alone, and I'm staying behind." "But I brought all my stuff here to stay overnight." "That's fine. Leave it here. It won't be the last time you will be sleeping over. That guest bedroom is yours for now. Stan already put all your things in there." She looked around and then looked back at him. "Whose room is this?" "It's mine." She paled and he laughed. "Don't worry. This is the last time you will be seeing the inside of it. The guest bedroom is downstairs and mine was most convenient for the doctor." Nodding, she replied, "Oh, thank you." "Are you feeling better?" Then she suddenly changed topic. "It was you that day in the parking lot. You knew it was me when I came in to interview with your grandmother. Why did you let her hire me?" Smiling, he said, "I knew you would put two and two together when you saw Stan." He leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "Well, let's just say my grandma can get stubborn at times, and I knew you would be able to put her in her place. It's not easy to work with a woman whose mind can sometimes believe she knows best." "I suppose so. I'm really sorry about what happened that day." "No, you're not," he said as he leaned forward. "You're only sorry you got caught." Thank you for tuning in. Chapter 3 will be out shortly.
We were crazy in love, careless and young, but I wouldn't change it. You had me right from the start, you gave me your all, but something changed, yeah. And I sometimes drive you crazy, but I need you. Yeah, I sometimes drive you crazy. And I think that's why you've been building up this wall now, and I don't really know how I'm supposed to break it down. I tried peeking through the cracks.